Hi, everybody. I was a little slow in getting here because my page didn't want to refresh. But thank you very much for coming. I'll take a little bit of time to share, and I hope you'll share with me. And then I'll be joining you very soon. Okay. Okay, I'm in now. I'm going to leave it to everyone else to share from now on so I can get down to business. Okay, hi Russ, hi Kay, hi Rick Maynard, Kathy Langen, hi Dale Weaver, Lana Dell. It's good to see you all. Hi Kay, hi Steve, hi Bonnie. And Rick Maynard calls our attention to the video by Nomiki Kantz. Okay, I think it's a very good video. I don't know if it's exactly right. I think she's probably right on the probabilities of this, that, okay, or the other happening, but I'm not sure she's fully excluded the possibilities. Okay, and but also Marcia Quinn, Norin is here. Hi, Marcia. It's been a while. Thank you for coming. Uh, okay, the biggest question, of course, I think, at least the question of the moment, I don't know if it's the very biggest question in the world, but it's the biggest question for the moment is she right? Okay, is it really the case that they really will not be able to rig this? Okay, and that if Bernie continues to win elections, that he's going to be the nominee. So that's the primary question that I want to discuss. And I'm going to start off with an article from Jacobin, which I'll get to in just a moment. It's a few days old now. It was by Adam Eichen and was published on February 24th. Let me put this into clearly so you can see it better. Let me double check that you can see it better. I guess you can. So, okay, the author makes the point in a functional democracy, there wouldn't be a Bloomberg candidacy. And of course, that's true. And the author goes through some of the history of what's happened since 1974, when our campaign finance system started to get broken. And then he points to Bloomberg's campaign and the fact that if you're worth $62 billion, you can spend as much of it as you want to become the president of the United States. And he points out that Bloomberg, at the time he was writing, had already spent over $400 million on the campaign and had gotten into the debates, but had a dumpster fire debate performance. Okay, so that was the first one. Okay, in other words, it was the Nevada debate he was thinking about here. And he points out that Bloomberg is not the first presidential candidate to self-fund, that distinction goes to Ross Perot in 1992. But of course, he spent nowhere near what Bloomberg, is spending now. In fact, in 1992, I'm not even sure that Bloomberg had $1 billion at that time. And I think Ross Perot did, but that he was only worth about $1.5 billion at that time, and he spent a lot less than that in his campaign. In 2016, Trump spent approximately $66 million in personal funds. So anyway, the author talks about Howard Schultz and Tom Steyer, who decided to run with no political qualifications, and who spent a bit. And Tom Steyer is still spending considerable money on the campaign. And then he says, make no mistake, though, when it comes to using personal fortune, the former mayor, Bloomberg, is in a league of his own. In just 2 months, he shattered the previous self-funding record set by Donald Trump. And the author points out that to stop this kind of thing in the long term, we need a new majority on the Supreme Court or a constitutional amendment to overturn Buckley versus Valeo, the decision rendered by the Supreme Court in 1976. Fortunately, several presidential candidates have explicitly committed to doing what they can to make this happen. And he says overturning Buckley would also permit limits on the other main avenue the ultra-wealthy have used to dominate our politics, on independent expenditures. And he points out that the Center for Responsive Politics revealed over the past decade the 10 largest donors have spent an astounding $1.2 billion on federal elections, largely through outside groups, but not for themselves. Of course, in this campaign, it may be that that Bloomberg will even spend more than the 1.2 billion. I know my camera is off. I am trying to fix that. Looks like it's back on now. I will have to adjust some sound here. Make sure that does not become a problem. Okay, I think I'm fully back now. And can go on. So anyway, I was about to say that Bloomberg might actually spend more than 1.2 billion all by himself in this campaign if he continues on. He's not doing extremely well now. He's beginning to lose support in various states, including, I understand, in California. So the tide for Bloomberg may already be receding because of the debate performances that he's already had. But what Eichen says is that until constitutional change is possible, the left has to fight for public financing of elections. And he points out, though Congress can't limit how much someone like Bloomberg can spend, it can use public money to either provide funds or boost the value of small donations to allow candidates without any networks of wealth to be more viable. Yes, Congress can do that. And the author mentions reinvigorating our public financing system and offering it for congressional campaigns would be a counterweight to billionaire self-funding. Indirect public financing, free TV time, for instance, would be a necessary addition as well. Then he makes the point any public financing system will have to be very generous. And yes, it would. Of course, to counter Bloomberg, it would have to be very generous. It would have to cost in the billions of dollars. Eichen correctly points out public financing is far more important for congressional races than presidential ones. And that Bernie Sanders' national fundraising juggernaut cannot be replicated for down-ballot candidates. Yes, I personally think under the present situation that would be very hard. One reason is that I suspect, that right now that Bernie's effort is overshadowing all others, and that a lot of others, that quite a lot of us who are giving money to Bernie's campaign cannot also afford to fund another 10 or 20 candidates, or something like that. So it's hard for the people in congressional races to raise the kind of funding they need. However, it's not altogether clear that they have to raise in proportion as much money as Bernie has raised. I note that it was possible for Ocasio-Cortez to win in New York using roughly 1/10 the funding that Joe Crowley had. So perhaps that can be repeated in other places as well. Now, I understand Jessica Cisneros down in Texas this year has managed to raise from small donors and from unions $1 million for her campaign against Henry Cuellar. Now, he's going to outraise her in this campaign, probably already has. But I think $1 million should be plenty to allow her to get her message out in a single congressional district. And of course, what this is about is getting your message out. If you get your message out and you're running against a poor candidate, as Henry Cuellar is, you ought to be able to beat that particular candidate. Okay, another key reform Eichen talks about is ranked choice voting in the presidential general election. That would help third-party candidates. Eichen also points out that Bloomberg could easily choose to run as a third-party candidate to tank a Sanders presidency. Or maybe he, or another billionaire, will merely threaten to run as a third-party candidate, so that if there's a contested convention, party leaders will be pressured to select a centrist nominee. Now, that was an option that Bloomberg had this year. He might have run as the no labels third-party candidate. Okay, if he had actually begun the campaign in 2018 by putting a lot of money into no labels to stand them up as a third party, he would have gotten support from a number of the other billionaires, as well. And then maybe a threat to run as a third party candidate would have basically blackmailed the party leaders to go with a centrist. And they might have done even more to try to block Bernie Sanders. Eichen points out ranked choice voting would end the spoiler effect of a third-party candidacy, effectively removing the ability of a billionaire to hold a political party hostage. And that probably would be the case, because if we had ranked choice voting in terms of the primaries, the Democratic primaries, then it would still be possible for a progressive to get into the top two and then to beat the centrist party candidate in a runoff, whether Bloomberg or somebody else was there as a third party candidate or not. The author makes the point, ultimately, to truly ensure a billionaire cannot buy elections, it may well be that a Bloomberg-style candidacy needs to be both legally and economically impossible. This means actually taxing the wealthy. After all, economic inequality has skyrocketed since Buckley, and our democratic system is collapsing under the weight of money. And he says it's time to move beyond plutocracy by reforming the laws governing our elections and our country to democratize power for now and for the future. And of course, we all agree with that particular sentiment, but it's easily said than done when it's possible for Bloomberg, as he did in 2018, to contribute and to buy the loyalty of 40 Democratic congressional candidates, as we hear he has done. And a number of the congressional candidates he has backed were able to get into office. He had a greater number of successes than Justice Democrats, for example, in terms of the people who they backed actually getting into Congress or staying in Congress. I think in the end there were only 5 Justice Democrats who either remained in Congress or who were newly elected to Congress. Now, they are all outstanding people, and they have made a big difference. But there are all these quiet centrists who were backed and got into Congress partly due to Bloomberg's donations. which were in the millions of dollars in each case. Of course, he did this through PACs, back end groups. I mean, he couldn't do it himself because he, like the rest of us, is limited to a $2,800 donation to each person. Okay, so the bottom line is we have to pass some laws. But how do we pass the laws when the Congress people are completely bought? The answer to that, of course, is that we have to have a movement, which is what Bernie has been doing. And that movement has to make a big difference in the Congress so that it really cannot be defied by the lawmakers. And of course, it has to insist on the reform of the laws. And while we're getting to the reform of the laws, I have to mention, as I have, on a number of occasions, that it would be possible for a Congress that was so inclined not to wait for a constitutional amendment to go about the business of passing one and getting it started. But if we don't want to wait 7 years for the ratification of such an amendment, it would be necessary for Congress to basically pass the text of such an amendment into law and perhaps a number of other enabling acts and make them unreviewable by the Supreme Court by using the exceptions clause in Article 3, Section 2 of the Constitution, which allows Congress to prohibit the appeals courts from actually reviewing certain cases. So, it is possible to do that. Of course, the candidates or the people in office who would pass something like this would have to have the guts to do so, because there would be hugely loud howls from people in both parties, probably, about how this was subverting the Constitution and subverting our democratic system, because the Supreme Court is supposed to be so important, for our democratic system, when, of course, by now it's obvious to most of us that in recent years the Supreme Court has been far from a protection for our democratic system, but has been one of the most active forces actually undermining our democratic system in a variety of ways, and too numerous to go into here in this particular live stream. But anyway, moving on, there was an article in Dandelion Salad which appeared on February 26th by Jim Kavanaugh, entitled Bloomberg's Game. And this was originally published at The Polemicist, which is Kavanaugh's blog, and has since been published in Counterpunch. I believe it's in Counterpunch today as well. But I picked it up in Dandelion Salad, so here it is. And I'll make the type larger this way through Clearly so you can see, so I can share it with you. So the first thing that Kavanaugh feels, Jim Kavanaugh now, not Brett Kavanaugh, of course, feels compelled to say to Bloomberg about his candidacy is, "Thank you, Mike." In a few weeks, he, coupled with the Democratic Party and its allied media, have demonstrated the reality of class rule more clearly than reams of Marxist analysis could. That's a very good point. And of course, he points out that the party that purports to represent working people, and the only one through which they're effectively allowed to pursue their interests politically, defined a set of rules for participation in debates that were designed to ensure that only candidates with a certain depth and breadth of support, both among voters and donors, would be able to participate. On the basis of strict, and some would say arbitrary, enforcement of those rules, the party serially winnowed out a number of candidates, including women and persons of color, with particular attention to excluding an anti-war woman of color, specifically Tulsi Gabbard, of course. And after it was clear that the candidate with the strongest working class agenda was taking the lead, and after receiving an $800,000 donation from Bloomberg, the party changed its rules to allow him to participate in the debates. And then Jim Kavanaugh goes on to describe the horrific record of the mayor when he was the mayor of New York. Stop and frisk, the walking while black policy, which was a policy he bragged about. Talks about his record of calling his women employees fat broads. And I'm not going to repeat any of the other really objectionable things he said. And then, of course, he talks about the dozens of lawsuits for sexual harassment and for discrimination from women whom he still keeps silent under the discipline of non-disclosure agreements. And the author points out that it's the same Mike Bloomberg who's never been in favor of raising the minimum wage, and is still opposed to that, by the way, and is in favor of cutting Social Security and Medicare, and has been in favor of that also for a very long time. He's the same guy who thinks the financial crisis was caused by a liberal Congress forcing banks to end the practice of redlining, like the financial crisis would never have happened except for the fact that Congress forced the banks to end the redlining. Now, obviously, anybody who would say that doesn't know any economics at all, no real macroeconomics. So Bloomberg as president would be a macroeconomic disaster. And Jim Kavanaugh points out that Bloomberg was the 9th richest person in the world, with more wealth than 125 million of his fellow citizens. He also points out that he's the guy the Democratic Party, the Clintonites, who dominated, and their allied media pundits on CNN and MSNBC welcomed, indeed begged, to enter the race for their party's nomination, and changed the rules so he could. The same people who are now saying the party must allow someone who did not get the most votes to become the nominee because you can't change the rules. So when I, of course, noticed that this happened, the first thing that I personally thought about, well, if the party has already changed the rules to allow Mr. Bloomberg in and to allow him to have the chance to either get a nomination of the party or at least to block Bernie Sanders' path to the nomination, then doesn't this change the terms of the agreement that Bernie Sanders made with the Democratic Party when he entered the primary? Bernie Sanders took a loyalty oath to the party when he entered the party, saying he would accept the nominee of the party and support the nominee of the party and not run himself on a third party ticket. But of course, he made that agreement with the party under the rules that applied at that time. The rules that had been passed by the Rules Committee and that was supposed to govern the race in the party's primary. So here's the DNC unilaterally changing the rules without seeking the consent of those who made an agreement with the party to support its candidate. Now, from where I sit, that means, hey, the Democratic Party has broken its contract with Sanders. It had an implied contract with Sanders. He would take a loyalty oath and they would obey the rules that they themselves passed. In bringing Bloomberg in, they unilaterally changed those rules. Guess what? I think that as a matter of legality, that Bernie is no longer bound to stick with them. Who else is saying that? Who else is saying that except me? Anyway. So Jim Kavanaugh goes on and says, so thank you. Thank you all for confirming the Marxist critique of liberal capitalist identity politics and demonstrating conclusively, much more effectively than the leftists who have been saying it for 4 years, that the Democratic Party is not opposed to Donald Trump because of his racism, sexism, or reactionary economic views. Yes, after all, it can't be because Michael Bloomberg apparently shares those views in large part. He certainly has exhibited racism, sexism, and reactionary economic views. And Jim Kavanaugh says, yes, conclusively, since the candidate you've gone out of your way to make room for is demonstrably, unequivocally worse than Donald Trump on all of those counts. Go ahead, try to change that worse to at least as. Make your case that Donald Trump did something as bad as having an army of police throw hundreds of thousands of black and brown kids per year against the wall for years, 5 million times, and demonstrate conclusively how bad and desperate your best argument is and how phony your stated concerns about those injustices are. Because it's quite obvious that Michael Bloomberg and Donald Trump are interchangeable. In terms of political substance, if Michael Bloomberg had won the presidency in 2016 as a Republican, which he very well could have, the Democratic Party could very well be trying to run Donald Trump against him now. Why not? Actually, at one time, Donald Trump supposedly was a Democrat. He became a Republican to run for the presidency. And Bloomberg had been a Republican for a long time until very recently, and then he declared as a Democrat. So he would have the option of running for the presidency as a Democrat. I mean, they are, in many ways, highly interchangeable. The only differences between them, says Jim Kavanaugh, are differences of style. Trump is crass, loudmouth, impetuous impetuous plutocrat. Bloomberg is a steel-eyed, cold fish plutocrat. So it's medium hot versus medium cool narcissism and arrogance. And by the way, contempt for the Constitution. Kavanaugh continues, they both care nothing about party affiliation because they're both members of the class that is the fundamental support and has the fundamental allegiance of both political parties. They can in fact flit easily from one party to another, using either as needed for their purposes. But political parties are their disposable tools. And the Democratic Party just exhibited, at least the DNC has exhibited, its willingness to become the tool, of Michael Bloomberg for a lousy $800,000 if this article is correct, or for a lousy $325,000 if the previous articles I've read on this subject are correct. I'm not sure which is correct. It doesn't matter. You should be just as ashamed of yourself for selling out for $800,000 as you are for selling out for $325,000. However differently expressed, their arrogance in our polity is entirely justified. It's the arrogance of the boss, and they're members of the class that is the boss of the political parties. So that's a very central point, of this article. And then he goes on. What Bloomberg is teaching us with the help of Democratic centrists and pundits is that what qualifies him in our system and in their eyes to be a president is his class status and allegiance, that he is a member of the ruling class who will prevent the slightest challenge to its rule. And then Jim Kavanaugh says, it's a wonderful lesson in the Marxist concept of class dictatorship, where dictatorship, of course, does not mean one-man rule, but absolute political hegemony. Well, I won't go on with the Marxist aspect, of this analysis. The key point, though, is that this is a big proof that an oligarchy has been very, very well established, and it is an unmasking of the oligarchy which dominates the Democratic Party, no less than the Republicans under Trump. That what we're seeing is the politics, of oligarchy, and as Patrick Martin said, quote, it is naked and shameless. And then thing two that Mike is telling us, and that is that he's not running to win the Democratic Party nomination or to defeat Donald Trump. Let's take the last of those ostensible goals first, because it reveals a lot about the other one. Consider the question, if Bloomberg wanted to defeat Trump, why didn't he primary him? The answer, obviously, is that he could not defeat Trump in the Republican Party, no matter how much money he spends, and he knows it. He might do some damage to Trump, even enough to weaken him in the general, but he can't defeat him. His money cannot buy enough votes to defeat Trump. And the same answer just as obviously applies in the Democratic Party. He can't win the nomination of the Democratic Party, no matter how much money he spends, and he knows it. Maybe in the depths of his arrogance, says Kavanaugh, he imagines, as one might, that the Trump derangement syndrome running amok among the Democratic voters, combined with the $1 billion in ad spending, would make his victory possible. But that would only work if Bloomberg's actual record, as well as his repellent attitude, demeanor, the author says, could be thoroughly hidden and ignored, and there was no effective candidate that was opposing him. But social media and Bernie et al. Make that impossible, especially since he's entering so late. So, no, I think he knows he cannot win. So, Bloomberg could not win in either party. And he could not win in the third party because Trump would run to the left of Bloomberg and eat him alive. And he knows it, and the Democratic Party knows it. What Bloomberg can do is exactly the same thing he could do in the Republican primary. And I think this was very perspicacious, okay, of Kavanaugh. Exactly what he could do in the Republican Party, except worse. That is, he could hurt the front runner. What he can do is ensure no one else wins the majority of delegates. And the front runner and only one else he entered the race to hurt is Bernie Sanders. And then Jim goes on to say, Michael Bloomberg is not running to win the nomination of the Democratic Party or to defeat Donald Trump. He's running for one reason, to stop Bernie Sanders. But given what he and the Democratic Party and everybody with eyes to see know, that means he's running to make sure that someone else who cannot be him wins the nomination. And then he says, here's the dilemma for the Democratic Party as a primary agent of the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. I don't see them as the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, I'm afraid. I think the bourgeoisie is a much, much larger group than the group that Bloomberg is an agent of. I mean, he's the agent of the 1,000th of 1%. I don't think that's the bourgeoisie exactly. It must prevent Bernie Sanders from becoming the nominee. And it also must do all it can to prevent a widespread and radical rupture with the Democratic Party, which would imperil the two-party duopoly that's been a crucial support of class dictatorship. Note well, beating Donald Trump in the general election is not on this list of party musts. It would be nice and all, but important things first. We all know what's coming. Bernie will likely have a plurality of delegates, but with Bloomberg's help, the party can ensure Bernie Sanders will not win the majority needed for a first-round victory. We know that. No matter how large a plurality Bernie has on the second round of voting, deals will be made to combine superdelegates and other candidates' delegates to elect the nominee other than Bernie. That nominee, however, cannot be Michael Bloomberg, no matter how many delegates he has. He cannot credibly be allowed to steal a nomination from Bernie, and he and the Democratic Party know that. Stealing a nomination from Bernie for anyone will risk that radical rupture the party must try to avoid. Stealing it for Bloomberg would guarantee that rupture. Bernie Sanders himself might withhold even pro forma support from Bloomberg, and he certainly would not campaign for him as he did for Hillary. Bernie supporters would just leave the party for good. I think that's a really good analysis. I'd certainly leave the party for good. Actually, I've kind of left it, though. I'm still registered. Anyway, a large chunk of his voters will stay home as Trump plays the mini Mike's racist, sexist, austerity tapes on a loop and wins by a landslide. I thought that was a good image. The Democratic Party will be reduced to Pelosi, Schiff, and Schumer fishing around for Russiagate 4.0. There must be a third candidate to whom the party can give the nomination. And it must be someone whom Bernie Sanders himself and a large chunk of his supporters might be persuaded to stay in the party and support. There is only one such candidate. That is Elizabeth Warren. Who else? Amy or Pete? Too ridiculous. Warren benefits from the fact that there are a whole lot of people who for a long time bought into the idea that Warren was on the same progressive side as Bernie. Though she's largely destroyed that charade, there is still a remnant. There is a remnant of nation type, okay, progs who promote it, and with their help and MSNBC's, she can resuscitate some zombie form of it. Bernie Sanders himself, I cringe to say, would support and campaign for Elizabeth Warren. God, I would really, really hate to see that. But the author goes on. But nominating Elizabeth Warren, no matter how few delegates she has, getting the rest, but precisely from Bloomberg et al., would still lose a lot. Most, I think, of Bernie's supporters, and would also be a loser against Trump. But it carries the only hope of both stopping Bernie and preserving any semblance of some credibility for the progressiveness of the Democratic Party. Yes, she would still lose a lot, and most, I think, as well, of Bernie's supporters, and would still be a loser against Trump. But Bloomberg doesn't care about that. He's been doing fine since Trump has been in office. In fact, I think when Trump had left office, his fortune was only at $35 billion. I'm sorry, when Trump came into office, I seem to remember that Bloomberg's fortune was only $35 billion. It was not that much more at that time than George Soros' fortune was. So under Trump, his fortune has increased by $25 billion. Why would he care if Trump won? I mean, Trump is following a pro-Israel right-wing regime type of foreign policy. He's crunching the Palestinians, or helping to crunch them under the boot heel of the Israelis. I'm certain that Bloomberg would do exactly the same thing. Okay? And Trump is now proposing cuts to Social Security and increasing austerity for everyone else. So why would Bloomberg care if Trump actually wins? I mean, I think, and Jim thinks as well, that what Bloomberg is doing is he's in this to stop Bernie Sanders. And that's really it. He's not in it to stop Trump. He wins, whether Trump wins or Trump loses. In fact, he'll have more time for his business interests if Trump actually defeats whichever candidate he helps to become the nominee of the Democratic Party. Jim Kavanaugh says, if I'm right, this will become the ongoing kabuki theater in the weeks ahead, in which Warren sets herself up as the non-socialist and therefore effective anti-billionaire candidate, luring woke, professional, and managerial progressives desperate for an alternative, quote unquote, to Bernie. This is the only way for Warren to revive her campaign and audition for the endgame. Fake left, attacking Bloomberg and dragging on Bernie's popular coattails. And then Kavanaugh says, wow, Liz was tough. She's back on our side. Did you see everyone tweeting about how we should consider her as Bernie's VP again? She's holding out a really nice apple. Yeah, she's holding out the apple for Snow White to bite on, right? But please watch Lawrence O'Donnell after the quote rough exchange unquote in which Warren smacked Mr. Bloomberg relentlessly, pointing out that they had a quote very cordial conversation that was real unquote and quote had absolutely nothing to do with everything else he saw on TV during a debate unquote. Liz is socking it to Mike just as she did to Hillary until she supported her. And Warren now has Hillary's people running her campaign. Rough but cordial these exchanges are. Warren will really be Bloomberg's plus one. Given the 15% eligibility rule for delegates, the DNC will not want more than two other candidates, including Bloomberg, vying for delegates against Bernie much longer. Okay? Bloomberg costs them nothing and can stay in forever. So the DNC will browbeat the other lame-ass candidates, but for example, Buttigieg and Klobuchar, and I guess they'll try to browbeat Tom Steyer as well, into quitting quickly and direct donors to Warren's new super PAC. Re-energized by this money and her newly rediscovered anti-billionaire style of rhetoric, all of which just happened to appear as the prospect of a Bernie plurality loomed as inevitable, Warren will spend the rest of the campaign frontally attacking billionaire Bloomberg while passively aggressively sniping at Bernie's divisiveness and steering the critique away from class conflict. Bloomberg and she will accumulate enough delegates to prevent a first-round convention vote victory for Bernie. Then in the second round, the DNC will persuade Bloomberg and whoever else has delegates, and with bribes from him, to give their delegates to Warren. The party will triumphantly say, quote, see, we've nominated the other anti-billionaire leftist, neither a billionaire nor a communist. Goldilocks. Interesting scenario, right? Bloomberg will have spent $1 billion to get Elizabeth Warren nominated by being her whipping boy, and he will be happy to have done it because he will have, quote, got done, unquote, what he wanted most, the defeat of Bernie Sanders and the leftist movement he inspired in the Democratic Party at least, and a tenuous preservation of the oligarchic party duopoly. Call it a sacrifice that's a lesson to us all in class solidarity, or call it Trump change. Maybe Trump change. What will become of that leftist movement outside of the Democratic Party? Who knows? But it's the right question to ask. Maybe that's the biggest question. Maybe the biggest question is whether this scenario can come to pass. I'm not entirely sure what the biggest question is at this point. We'll see quickly how it's going to play out. If Warren continues the rhetorical strategy from the Nevada contest, money pours into her super PAC, and Pete and Amy drop out, it will become obvious that the process is unfolding towards the denouement I've suggested. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the road ahead to the nomination is less sinuous than I imagine. Maybe Warren won't climb to the nomination on the back of Michael Bloomberg, but will be crushed under his feet. And maybe Bloomberg will either run from the criticisms or really buy the whole thing up for himself. Oh, the camera has gone south again. Sorry. I will make an adjustment once again. There I am. I should be on again. Let me double check this. Okay, so back to it. So maybe Bernie will stumble and not get a plurality. Maybe the Dems will come up with another Deus ex machina candidate at the convention. I've heard Sherrod Brown mentioned by a longtime Democratic operative. But none of these candidates will work as well for the Democratic Party's purposes. I think this Bloomberg Warren Punch and Judy show, I think I like the Kabuki show better, culminating in the victory of the strong woman against the arrogant billionaire, is the only way the Democratic Party can both steal a nomination from Bernie and hope to keep any of his supporters and possibly even Bernie himself in the fold, or indeed to preserve any credibility for the two party the plutocratic system. And the bonus, when Trump beats Warren, they can blame it on the people's sexism rather than the rejection of the plutocracy. And of course, they can mobilize hashtag resistance and hashtag impeachment 2.0. It's a hell of a game. Snakes and the ladders. So I thought that was a great piece, and that scenario was great as well. But you know what? Very much depends on Super Tuesday and how well Bernie does. Because people in the party are both panicking, of course, and talking about real strong resistance to Bernie. But some of them, Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and Al Sharpton, okay, and others, seem to be starting to come to terms with a possible Bernie win. The other thing that's going on is that Bernie himself is moving aggressively against Senator Warren in Massachusetts. His campaign has noticed that in Massachusetts right now, there is a 50-50 split in the polls between Bernie and Warren. Bernie could possibly beat Warren in her own home state very soon now. And if that happens, then the scenario that Kavanaugh was outlining then becomes very hard to swallow. Because Warren will have passed one of the litmus tests of history concerning what a nominee of the Democratic Party has to do. That litmus test, okay, is the litmus test that they be able to win their own state in the primary, their home state. She may not be able to hold her home state if Bernie's momentum continues. He doesn't even have to win South Carolina for that. He could just show well in South Carolina, and he'd have an excellent chance of crushing Warren in her home state. And where does Mayor Bloomberg go then? Also, his second debate performance in South Carolina was not great. It was not great. It was not even good. It was pretty poor. It wasn't the total disaster that his first one was, but it was pretty bad. And meanwhile, his record as mayor, his record as a person, his record in terms of policies that he previously supported is getting circulated all over the country, if not by the mainstream media, by the alternative media, by us. There's a lot of us now in the alternative media. And the us's in the alternative media, taken together, have millions of subscribers on YouTube and big presences on Facebook. And we're all spreading the news about what a monster Mayor Mike is. And by the way, not much has even been said so far about Mayor Mike as an austerity warrior, as an austerity monger. I mean, Mayor Mike's going to lose primary after primary when word gets around that one of the first things he's going to do is cut Social Security and Medicare. He's sure to do that. He's advocated for that his whole life long. He used to be a big supporter of a no labels third party movement. Sank a lot of money into that. All they were about was doing the kind of thing that the Bowles-Simpson Commission, the BS Commission, advocated for in the early days of the Obama administration, and well, 2010 anyway, fairly early, okay, in the 8 years, okay, of Obama. That was known as the Cat Food Commission. Bloomberg's campaign could easily become known as the Cat Food Campaign. And then, how many old folks are going to be supporting Michael Bloomberg in primary states? His support is going to tank. He's a cold warrior. He's aggressive in foreign policy. He's an austerity monger. He opposes Medicare and Social Security. I don't think it likely that if he is able to chase out Amy Klobuchar, okay, and Buttigieg, if he's able to buy their consent to actually get out of the race, I don't think that Bloomberg and Warren are going to be able to consolidate their delegates. Nor do I have a lot of confidence at this time that if Joe Biden does decently well in South Carolina, that they'll be able to chase Joe Biden out. And then, as I said, they're going to have to contend with Warren's possible loss in her home state, which is going to be a major bond if she does lose. So, I want to move now to a third piece by William Rivers Pitt at Truthout. Will the Democratic Party deny Sanders a nomination even if he wins? Well, maybe that's the biggest question. Maybe that's the biggest question. Let's look at this one through clearly. We, the supporters of Bernie, are described as optimistically terrified, warily thrilled, and uneasily cheerful. Why? Because Bernie is the clear front runner to secure the nomination. But there's a Democratic Party whose core establishment wants nothing more than to stop him in his tracks. Fueling the Sanders camp's fears and dampening their pleasure is the very real concern the party might thwart his nomination at the convention. The party has the tools to do it if the pieces fall into place just so. This unsteady situation would leave anyone in disorder, including ourselves, the supporters of Bernie Sanders. Here's but one example of the nonsense fueling this binary state of being. The Democratic establishment types have been trying to convince people that Sanders' successes in Iowa and New Hampshire are meaningless, are the same ones arguing that those successes amount to a complete capitulation to Donald Trump in November. And so William Rivers Pitts says, if you want to have a cake, you can't eat it, because if you eat it, you don't have it anymore. Children understand this idiom better than the leadership of the Democratic Party. This nonsense is flowing entirely from the party's establishment wing and is being magnified to a full-throated roar by their hyperventilating mouthpieces in the news media. The latest line of attack on Sanders is that he has a ceiling, that he cannot expand his base beyond angry college students who want free everything and boorish Twitter warriors who may or may not be paid Russian trolls. Sanders sends Democratic establishment into panic mode, reads a Monday Morning Politico headline. That was last Monday. The moderates firmly believe a Sanders primary win would seal Donald Trump's re-election, explains the article. And yet, within that very same Politico piece, there is this. It was not just Sanders' victory, but the lopsidedness of the outcome that struck fear into moderate Democrats. In one day, Sanders proved that he could broaden his coalition beyond the narrow base that many assume would limit his appeal. In 2016, Sanders struggled with African American voters, but now he's narrowing the gap between himself and Biden in South Carolina. The idea that Sanders could be a truly formidable national candidate is beginning to penetrate the fog of establishment Democratic disquiet. The numbers out of Nevada bear the strength of Sanders' standing out in explicit detail. Sanders prevailed in virtually every category required to burst through that ceiling. The Democratic establishment would have us believe constrains his national chances. Latinx voters, white voters, women, men, union voters, non-union voters, in every age group except 65 and older. And by the way, to comment on that, if everybody was made aware of my presentation of last night on savings for couples 65 and over from Bernie's agenda, if the whole thing passes, very few people in the 65 and older group would be voting for anyone else except Bernie Sanders. Because most of those people would badly need the many thousands of dollars of savings and gains that they will get from a Sanders agenda and from nobody else who is running for office. They just don't understand that because the Sanders campaign has not yet competently conveyed it to them, what their self-interest is. Going on, while Biden outperformed Sanders among black voters in Nevada, it was not by a great margin. And Bernie has been making steady gains with that group. His strength with black voters will meet a sterner test in South Carolina. Perhaps most importantly, he's capturing the allegiance of voters who don't often participate or have never participated before. Nearly half the country stayed home in 2016. If Sanders is the candidate who can bring them to the voting booth, that final piece establishes an overwhelmingly powerful and comprehensive coalition. Put another way, Sanders is constructing a coalition that looks like what the Democratic Party advertises itself as: diverse across a vast swath of demographics and age groups. If Joe Biden, Mike Bloomberg, Mayor Buttigieg, Amy Klobuchar, Tom Steyer were pulling down numbers like Bernie, the party would be building statues in their honor outside of DNC headquarters. Yet, with all the pieces Sanders has in place, all the momentum he enjoys, and all the polling leads he holds, it is Bernie can't win from the establishment wing almost across the board. The New York Times, MSNBC, The Washington Post, and other publications and outlets all echo a similar theme. If Elizabeth Warren or Tulsi Gabbard were standing in the Sanders place, we would be having virtually the same conversation. This is the present truth facing any progressive candidate seeking the nomination of the Democratic Party. The party has been violently allergic to such candidates since the McGovern debacle in 1972, and even more so since the Reagan Revolution in 1980. Well, I don't know if I quite agree with that. It may seem like it has been violently allergic since 1972, but I do believe that if not for the the Mary Jo Kopechne affair in the was it in the late 60s or the 1970 or something like that, I do think the party would have been ready to accept another Kennedy in 1976. Unfortunately, the country was not ready for Ted Kennedy back then, but he certainly would have run on a New Dealish type of platform, won on that type of platform, and worked for it, in contradiction to Jimmy Carter. But anyway, to go on. And even more so since the Reagan Revolution in 1980. After the Clintons took over the party in 1992, their elixir was to lean right so as to bring in the moderate quote unquote Republican voters. As the GOP has moved further to the right, however, the Democrats have moved with them so as to mollify voters who today would find a Republican like Richard Nixon intolerably liberal. That's so true. It is a recipe for failure, and the results have become obvious. Hillary Clinton's weak showing was not some black swan outlier event, but a bright red warning light the Democratic establishment refuses to heed. When half the country refuses to vote, even as the oceans rise, the cost of healthcare explodes, and the fiction of the healthy economy becomes more obvious by the hour, it means you're doing it wrong. There are some in the news media who argue that the Democratic Party will come around, that winning will be its own elixir if Sanders is able to continue with his success. Fears of down-ticket losses will be offset by gains in places the Democrats have long feared to tread, such as Georgia, Texas, and also Nevada. The energy of the 2018 midterms has not abated, and the word socialist simply isn't as scary as it used to be, especially among the young voters who will make or break this contest. Yet there is a reason why Biden and Bloomberg and Klobuchar and Buttigieg will not abandon their campaigns anytime soon. The reason is the convention. If Sanders does not have enough of a delegate lead, the party's nomination rules will allow so-called superdelegates to tilt the nomination away from the candidate with a clear majority of delegates. Well, I guess the problem is, in this case, that he wouldn't have had a clear majority. He might have had a clear plurality But if he has a clear majority, he will be nominated. Going on. This quartet of establishment candidates will stay in for as long as they can, and Mayor Bloomberg may make it possible for all of them to stay in, by the way, by seeing they all get money through super PACs that he contributes to. But it's more likely that rather than continuing to split the votes, so too many of those people get under 15% and don't get any delegates, it's more likely that the mayor will come down on the side of chasing Klobuchar and also Mayor Buttigieg out, and maybe working with Biden, okay, and with Warren and himself, or maybe chasing Biden out, also, okay, working only with Warren, okay, as Kavanaugh says, or chasing Warren out, okay, and working only with Joe Biden. So I don't know which way that's going to turn. Those are all scenarios that could occur. But to finish the sentence, the quartet of establishment candidates will stay in for as long as they can because they see the possibility of becoming a nominee if the party decides that it cannot abide Sanders. If Warren somehow surges past Sanders in the coming contests, she will face the same convention dilemma. The Wall Street money fueling the Democratic establishment fears her as much as they do Sanders, if not more. I'm not sure he's right about that. The reason being, I think the Democratic establishment thinks that Warren would lose to Trump, so they might well accept a scenario like the one that Jim Kavanaugh laid out, okay, a scenario where Warren becomes the nominee. Why would they accept that? Because they think Trump would win. They would remain in control of the party, and all the Wall Street money would continue to fuel the Democratic establishment and prop up the deal flows of the consultants and the strategists that they depend upon to work with their allies in the media in order to create, okay, an atmosphere favorable to the establishment continuing to hold power. So, William Rivers Pitt says this is hardly without precedent. The party bosses withheld their nomination from George McGovern. Withheld their support from George McGovern in 1972. In that instance, after he secured the nomination, because they made a very cynical calculation. In their minds, a second Nixon term was preferable to losing control of the party. And by the way, that worked out kind of well for them because of what happened in the second Nixon term, which was the near impeachment of Nixon and his leaving office, and then they're taking control of the White House again through the Jimmy Carter candidacy in 1976. Now, by the way, they're not that thrilled with Jimmy Carter. He was a little too independent for them, but at least he was not a raving progressive who was going to do things that really pissed off the Wall Streeters. That's not what he did. Will the powers that be within the Democratic establishment make the same calculation at the convention in Wisconsin this summer? And William Rivers Pitt says they might. They can if Sanders fails to capture a dominant majority of delegates during the primaries and caucuses. It's the rules. And he says there's a scene in the baseball movie Major League, we're getting into movies now, when the team finds out the owner is doing everything she can to make them lose for her own financial gain. Well, then I guess there's only one thing left to do, says the catcher played by Tom Berenger. Quote, win the whole fucking thing, unquote. For Bernie Sanders, his campaign, and his supporters, that is the best and only answer. If he arrives at the convention with a clear majority of delegates, it will be hard to deny him the nomination. It will be impossible without destroying the party. And if the party is destroyed, they're not going to get their deal flows anyway. And if the party is destroyed, the Wall Street money is not going to flow to them anyway. Because why would you spend money on people who no longer have any power? If the party's destroyed, those people won't have any power. That's a factor which everybody has to consider. Yeah, their preferred choice might be for Trump to win and them to stay in control for 4 more years. But if they see to it that someone other than Bernie Sanders is nominated for the party nomination, and we walk out and break the party, or if they think there's a great possibility we will do that, then they would have to face the possibility that their deal flow is not going to continue anyway. William Risbit goes on, these are not all sunshine and roses for the senator from Vermont. His fumbled answer to a question on the CBS News program 60 Minutes, asking how he intends to pay for his ambitious program, opened an avenue of attack from his rivals. His refusal to fall into Cold War absolutism regarding Fidel Castro has become grist for the conservative mill and raises concerns about his ability to win Florida in November, and even to win Florida in the primaries. Bloomberg is dipping into his bottomless fortune to pay for a massive ad buy attacking Sanders on all fronts. We'll be seeing that in the next 2-3 weeks. Such is the life of a presidential frontrunner in the 21st century. The Sanders campaign will have to rise to these challenges, and others will undoubtedly follow if they wish to sustain the momentum that has carried them to this point. Even with these bumps in the road, the overall trends are moving in Bernie's favor. He stands a decent chance of defeating Joe Biden in South Carolina on Saturday, according to the latest CBS News poll, and is positioned to make a dominant showing nationally on Super Tuesday. A more recent Data for Progress poll suggests that Bernie will win in South Carolina. It suggests that. Okay, and Data for Progress has been pretty good on its polling this year thus far. It has been better than most of the major pollsters. It hasn't participated as much, but it knows how to poll, maybe better than most others do. So Bernie's coalition is broad and expanding. He's the favorite candidate for a huge segment of voters who've not been participating because their Democratic choices have been candidates in the failed centrist vein of Biden and Hillary Clinton. He leads Trump in a head-to-head matchup according to the last 10 national polls. And by the way, in the polls since then, he has continued to either lead Trump or to be tied with Trump. Okay, at least he either leads Trump or is tied with Trump in the key states of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania right now. And most think he's ahead of Trump in all 3 states. Bernie's most immediate impediment is the party whose nomination he seeks. The term vote blue no matter who was much favored in establishment the Democratic circles back when Joe Biden was leading the race. If the establishment is not able or willing to ensure that the slogan applies to Sanders too, the party could face the kind of conflagration it may never recover from. Our job is to see to it that they will absolutely face that sort of conflagration if they attempt any of that sort of rigging with respect to Bernie Sanders. They've got to be convinced beyond any reasonable doubt that they're going to lose the whole progressive bloc, whether Bernie decides to go with them or not. And I think everybody should begin to use the argument that I made earlier, that they're changing the rules to allow Michael Bloomberg to come into the primaries and to create a situation where the road to the nomination for Bernie was vastly impeded, that their decision to do that was a deal breaker. It broke the rules which applied at the time that Bernie agreed not to go third party. Everybody needs to make that argument. We have to make the Democrats realize that contractually and morally, Bernie Sanders is no longer bound to run inside of the Democratic Party if they proceed with their attempts to screw him. That we are not going to tolerate it. I want to make one more comment before I go to your comments. Let me shift my view. I saw earlier this evening a video by Nomiki Konst. I thought it was a very good video and well reasoned, where she argues that because of how close the Bernie Sanders is going to get to a clear majority, that even if he emerges with just a plurality, it will be such a large plurality that they will face the prospect. I don't know why I'm losing my camera today, but I'm back. Okay. So she thinks that the plurality he will get will be sufficiently large that they will recognize that it will be too dangerous for them to overthrow it by using the superdelegates, okay, or in any other way, and that they will recognize that what they have to do is to accept the nomination that Bernie will have earned, okay, at that point. And she thinks that they will do that because if they don't do that, they would certainly lose to Trump. And I gather she believes, or she's not of the school of people who believe quite yet, that they'd rather lose to Trump than have to support and work with a Bernie nomination. Now, I'm not too clear on that. I have to watch her video again. I didn't have a lot of time, okay, to get into it, okay, and to analyze it. Okay, but I think that she's assuming that they're not going to want to lose to Trump. If that's true, I think that's a dangerous assumption and not one that should be easily made, because those consultants, those strategists, many of those superdelegates would prefer to nominate someone else and lose to Trump than to have Bernie Sanders with a good chance to become the president of the United States and to end the regime that they have lived so well under. So I do think there are many of them that would prefer that. But having said that, there are 771 supers. They're not an entirely monolithic group. Okay, as Nomiki Kantz has argued, when delegates are freed up on the second round, okay, a lot of those delegates who might have been bound to Warren or might have been bound to Mayor Pete or might have been bound to Bloomberg will be free to vote for their second choice. And in many cases, their second choice will have been Bernie Sanders. So she's saying that Bernie may lose some first round votes that he had, but he'll gain a lot of the second choices. Okay, and I would add, I think he's going to gain some of the superdelegates too. There are some superdelegates who are Bernie supporters. I don't think, okay, that a majority of them, okay, are Bernie supporters, but I'll bet he gets 200 out of the 771. That leaves 571 over to get somebody to a majority of the 2376. But I don't think that anybody else other than Bernie is going to be close enough to the original 1991 votes that if they were to gain, okay, an additional 571 votes, that they could get to the 2376 necessary to nominate someone on the second ballot. Which brings in another factor which the Democrats will have to consider. And that is, do they really want to have the horror show of not just a second ballot, but potentially a third ballot or a fourth ballot? An old-timey convention? In some of those old-timey conventions, people weren't selected until the 34th ballot. Would the Democratic Party survive such a situation in the age of television and social media? Would it survive but all of the BS the whole country would be seeing as it moved through the various ballots? They'd be destroying the parties themselves. Some of the superdelegates might go over to the Bernie side on the second ballot just to avoid a third ballot, because they very well know the consequences of getting into a permanent stalemate. So Nomiki might be right in her argument, but not because the Democratic Party wants, but still wants to win, but maybe because it doesn't really help the superdelegates, okay, if the Democratic Party were to disappear altogether. Okay, and the progressives don't represent the only threat to disappearance altogether. There might be all kinds of Democratic voters who just come to the conclusion that they're through with this crazy party if they should go to a third ballot at this convention, because they can't come to a consensus on the leading candidate for the nomination, because their egos are just too big to get out of the race when they have no chance to win. Okay, or because a billionaire is propping, who they don't want at all, is propping up all these superdelegates and preventing the nomination of the person they want most of all. So, as a live streamer that I'm fond of likes to say, it's just a thought. I'll be going to your comments now. Thank you, Bo, the fifth column, for supplying that one. Okay. So here we are. Hey, I don't know if there are really 16 of you still here. Ah, it's now changed. So apparently I still have 10, which is very good considering how long I've been talking. So now I'd like to consider your comments. So let me see what's going on. I hope there have been a lot of shares here. I don't see too many shares on my screen here. So please do share, 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 which reminds me, I should probably subject you all to my commercial once more. Please share, like, and subscribe when this goes up on YouTube, and please become a patron at www.patreon.com/Joe_Firestone. And now back to your comments. Oh, did I go back to your comments? I don't know. I'm refreshing my page now. Please be patient. Okay, so there I am. I should be there now. Sandy Degg says Bloomberg put out an ad that he can save us all from the virus because he is wonderful in a crisis. Well, the crisis is now, and he's not going to be in a position to save us all from the crisis because, it's coming right now, and he's not the president and has no way of becoming the president. I have to silence the echo, sorry. Sandy Degg says Bloomberg is a disgusting waste of a human body. He may also be a dangerous waste of a human body. And so Lana says, as a mortgage person, that pisses me off. And Lana says, we're held to strict standards of lending, okay, and rightly so. Yeah, it did. That sort of claim always pissed me off. It was a claim of the plutocrats. They were unhappy that poor people were getting a chance to own homes. They were unhappy. The reason why the crash happened was because, of course, of their creative financial instruments that they sold, saying that they would limit the risk. They sold so many of the instruments that the value of what was out there in the market was many times the value of the assets of the whole world. They blew a bubble, and the bubble burst. And after it burst in the housing market, It spread to the rest of the domestic economy from the United States, and then from there to the world economy from the United States. And Lana said, I forgot about the oath. Did Bloomberg have to do it? I don't know. That's an interesting question. Didn't Bloomberg have to take the loyalty oath to the party? If Bloomberg didn't have to take the loyalty oath to the party, then they certainly can't hold Sanders to it. Sandy says, all bets are off. I agree with you, Joe. Let's hope Bernie agrees with me. Sandy said, Trump was a Democrat, and he said Republicans were stupid. He did. He said it in an interview with Oprah. Yeah, at one point, Oprah was one of his favorites, I think. Sandy says, okay, I agree Bloomberg is a turnoff. Yeah, I think so too. Great, big, gigantic turnoff. Steve says, okay, I believe that Bloomberg hit his ceiling. His numbers are going down. Well, his giant ads have to start hitting now. Those ads may draw support away from some of the others towards him, depending on the nature of the ads, or they may provide an opportunity for him and for one or two of the others to reach the threshold of 15% in some of the states, depriving Bernie of delegates that he otherwise would have gotten. Kay says, they're all turning me off at this point except Bernie. Yeah, me too. Sandy says, I can understand why Democrats would want to destroy their own party. So I can't understand why Democrats want to destroy their own party. It's like taking food out of their own mouths. Yeah, I don't think they do want to destroy their own party. But what some of them are doing now is basically saying, they're willing to take the risk that they may destroy their own party in order to stop Bernie Sanders from getting into the White House, because basically they're afraid that if Bernie Sanders gets into the White House, he's going to detach them from the gravy train that they're on anyway. So they're pretty sure he's going to take the food out of their mouths. So he figures I think they figure they might as well gamble on destroying their own party. What we have to convince them is that it's less likely that Bernie will take all the food out of their own mouths than it is that we will destroy the party and take all the food out of their mouths. Kay says, if they don't, Sandy, it's money out of their coffers. I think whatever happens, it's money out of their coffers. Except if Trump wins. Steve says, Warren is in danger of losing in her own state. She won't be in for long. Not if she loses in her own state. That should end her as a viable candidate, even if Bloomberg tries to prop her up. Kay says, yep, Steve, she's a liar too. Sandy says Bloomberg is a Republican. He's Trump's friend. He's helping him win. And Rick Maynard, I need to expand the screen a little bit because, here we go. Expand the view a little bit. Sorry about that. Rick Maynard says, makes the contract null and void. And Sandy says that apple has a worm in it, and its name is Liz. And Russ says, I won't vote for EW. I won't either. And Kay says, Sherrod Brown is no good. I'm from Ohio. The GOP ruined the state. And what has he done for Ohio lately? Or Tim Ryan either. Both ran for president and dropped out. They're a little better than the Ohio GOP idiots, but not much. Yeah, I think Sherrod Brown has been a tremendous disappointment. He looked promising 10 years ago, but now he just looks like a guy who sold out to the system. He protects the narrow interests of the union. He's basically protecting Richard Trumka and what he wants to do. Sandy says Bernie should go after her. She is a liar and she lied about him. He is going after her. He's going after her in Massachusetts. He wants to badly win Massachusetts. He wants badly to win Massachusetts. He knows he's strong there. He knows he has a foothold in the media market in Massachusetts. He knows that Warren is not as popular in her state as she should be. Certainly nowhere near as popular in Massachusetts as Bernie is in his home state. And evidently maybe not as popular in Massachusetts as Bernie is in that state. Lana says, can the establishment be so out of touch that Bernie going into the convention with with a huge majority and then stealing his nomination won't end up in a figurative, okay, or literal, uh, dis- uh, okay, in a figurative, okay, or a literal riot? Well, if Bernie goes into the convention with a majority at all, with 1,991 votes, then, okay, I think they're just going to accept it. I don't think they're considering trying to steal a nomination, for example, by saying that he's been disloyal to the Democratic Party, so we're simply invoking the rule that we can throw him out of the party and deny the nomination in that way. I don't think that they can attempt that. If they don't attempt that, and he has the 1,991 votes, which is just a majority, okay, not a huge majority, I don't think there's going to be any trouble. But if he comes up with a plurality, even if it's a huge plurality, for example, let's say he has 1,800 votes and his nearest competitors have combined and they now have 1,350 to 1,400 delegate votes, then I think some attempt might be made to stop his nomination on the first round and to enlist the help of the superdelegates to try to get him out in the second round. Russell says you can plan on that. Well, according to the New York Times, they did a survey of 100 of the superdelegates, and they are evidently planning to do that now, in case Bernie only gets a plurality. Sandy says it will be ugly if he doesn't win. People are not going to be happy. Kay says, yep, I'm hearing of an outright yellow vest protest at the convention if they do that. I hope it happens, Sandy says. I could see Pete jumping on the gravy train. He'll jump. He'll jump onto the Bloomberg the gravy train anytime. And Lana says, optimistically terrified, yes. Kay says, by the way, off topic, but good info. If you are on any meds that you need every day, you need to talk to your doctor or pharmacist to see if they're made in China or ingredients made in China and stock up a couple of months until hopefully this coronavirus is under control. They will run out of inventories quickly. I'll see what I can do about that. Sandy Deck says, senior woman union member voting for Bernie. Great, Sandy. And she replies to Kay saying, good to know. Kay says, yes, I'm not on any yet, but I always thought it was a very bad idea to start importing drugs or ingredients for them, okay, from other countries. Yeah, I always thought that was a bad idea too. I also thought that it was a bad idea to begin to import things that were necessary for national defense from other countries, okay, as well. And of course, I now think it's a very bad idea to import things from other countries that are necessary for energy independence in the United States, okay, as well. Uh, we need to go solar, okay, and wind, and we need to see to it that all the manufacturing we need for that is done in this country. Sandy says she's not going to pass Bernie. And Sandy says Trump would win against her. Sandy, I completely agree. And Lana says, oh my God, that's hideous. That's right. They shoot themselves in the foot, shoot themselves in the mouth. I think Warren will lose to Sanders in her home state, too. Sandy says he pays for it just like they're paying the CDC with appropriations from Congress without raising anyone's federal taxes. But he is going to raise some federal taxes. He indicated he would raise some federal taxes. Not for most people, but he's going to raise plenty of federal taxes for the rich. And one of the big reasons why he's going to do that is he knows there's a danger to democracy and that we got to do something about that. And Lana says, I like Bo with the fifth column. Yeah, so do I. And Rick said, must not show shares to message groups. No? Shares to message groups? Yeah, maybe they don't. Oh, wow. Looks like I've got 66 shares now. So thank you. Thank you. I know I did not do those 66 shares. For sure. Kathy says, oh, I see. Kathy Langan, Sandy Degg, and 2 other people joined. And Bonnie has joined again. I think Bonnie was probably thrown off at some point. She frequently gets thrown off. And Steve Wolfbrand says, I can't share the groups anymore, Doc. I'm pretty much in permanent Facebook jail. I share it to my page. Thank you, Steve. That's fine. I understand that because I've been in jail too. I haven't been in jail too often, but sometimes I was in Facebook jail and I didn't even know it. Facebook is so awful. I can't believe them. Do you have any advice for us who may be arrested at the convention? Sure, I have some advice, which is to put aside money to pay an attorney. Okay, and if we're part of groups that are sponsoring demonstrations at the convention, then those groups should raise money in order to pay attorneys. When you plan to get arrested, you have to have attorneys all lined up to help you to get out. The successful protesters are very good, at doing that. Sometimes they've managed to do that because they've enlisted some people as protesters who are attorneys. Sandy says, I will share to more groups before I go to bed. Thank you, Sandy. And Kay says, after protesting through the late 60s, early 70s, I would stay away from where the actual cops are. It was bad back then, too. I think it's much worse now. I think by the late 70s already, by the early 70s already, I think the police were beginning to get, a lot more gentle. But I think now, after the kind of thing that they did to Occupy and the kind of things they did actually during the Bush administration. They're back to their old police brutality tricks. And remember, the Occupy movement took a lot of physical punishment from the police under Bloomberg in New York City. Rick said, I haven't been out of jail too often. December 8th through March 8th. God, I'm getting out of jail soon. Oh my God. In jail from December 8th through March 8th. Oh, that's awful. Okay, thank you for coming. I've been on for nearly 2 hours and I've gone through all your wonderful comments. Thank you for the conversation. Have a very good day tomorrow. I won't be live streaming tomorrow, but I'll be back on Saturday night in my usual hour. If I come on tomorrow for any reason, okay, it'll be a surprise. I guess on Saturday I'll try to cover the South Carolina primary if results are available. Steve says, I'm out in April, but they usually throw me right back in. Yeah, I mean, once you're in a few times, they're on the lookout for you. I think they just have a squad of people, who are going to be on the lookout. So thanks again for coming, and good night. Good night, Lana.